This is the day that the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And just as the choir in Psalm 118 joyously acknowledges what God has done, so did the crowd cry in joyous acclamation when Jesus entered Jerusalem on an untrained donkey. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heavens. Just days later, they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" Shouted the crowd. Pilate asked, "Release Barabbas, the murderer, for the king of the Jews?" "Crucify him!" they shouted back. Pilate asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And thus Jesus was tried in the Sanhedrin, mocked, falsely accused, beaten, tortured, and left to hang on a cross for nearly 6 hours, and then said, "I thirst." I too know what it's like to thirst. Perhaps we all do. Like on a hot day, you're outside doing some lawn work, pruning the bushes, you're sweating. You want a drink. You're hot. You're in a traffic jam. For me in Baltimore, that's a lot. Maybe you guys sat at the Y once. Or a hot day when you go running. Maybe it was April 16th, 2012, up in Boston. Maybe it was the marathon. Maybe it was 96 degrees that day. There was no wind. I was thirsty. It was torture. And at this point in my life, I had already completed over a dozen marathons and ultramarathon distances, and it was hot that day, and I was not trained. It kicked my butt. It was a death march. I too know what it's like to thirst. Perhaps we all do physically. Physically speaking, I have read to believe Jesus' fifth word on the cross, "I thirst," was literally to wet his whistle. Perhaps to put a little more emphasis into his sixth and final seventh word. Physically, Jesus knows what it's like to be human. But what about spiritual thirst? At what point do we put our trust in Christ Jesus? Several years ago, I was in my mid-20s, and I was off the beam. My spiritual path fogged. I remember my 26th birthday, and I went out in the big town of Hughesville. Came back to Mom and Dad's, and I was sick. It was early hours of the night. I had not treated my body as a temple. I was in the bathroom. Mom heard my distress, came down, knocked on the door. Joel, leave. You don't want to see me like this." My head down in a toilet. "Joel, Mom, leave. You don't want to see me like this." I wouldn't look at her. I was spiritually bankrupt. The door closed behind me. A few moments later, the door opened. Mom put a glass of water on the sink and just walked away. I was spiritually thirsty. And I had to dig for a few more years to hit some bottom. I took the forbidden fruit. I cried, "Crucify him, crucify him." Now Christ hangs, dying for me on a tree. God forgives. God is love. Where a foolish child is a mother's grief, a wise child makes his father glad. The Proverbs of Solomon. In recent years, I've gotten active again. I actively participate in a youth group in Baltimore, and I love it. It's a joy. It's a joy. We go, we give a lesson, we hang out, we have fellowship, we play football. We hang out sometimes till 3 in the afternoon. I get to know these kids. And just last Sunday, I gave my first lesson on Palm Sunday to the children. And I studied. And of course, like anyone, any wise person would consult their resources. So I called Dad. Yada, yada, yada. It went well. there was a position here to speak today, and I offered. Now, as my brother would say, Dad, it's time to hear son number 2 blab off. But I am out of my comfort zone. I had to do my homework. I had to do this. Dad couldn't do this for me.